As some of you may know, I'm a huge Street Fighter fan from way back. I've been in love with the series ever since I got a copy of Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition and a 6-button stick for Christmas back in '93. Street Fighter 2 is easily the most well-known in the franchise. Its impact on the arcade scene, gaming at large, and its inclusion in pop culture are unrivaled by any sequel that would follow, or arguably any fighting game since. Street Fighter 2 is so well known that I reckon you'd be hard pressed to find anyone under the age of 40 who doesn't recognise this, even if they couldn't tell you where it was from. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the story of how and why it got to be so popular. No doubt you've heard this story many times before. Suffice to say that Street Fighter 2 was a very big deal in the 90s. What many people don't know is how many different versions of it there are. Between the 9 or so official games, give or take depending on if you count the console-specific titles and some of the more infamous ROM hacks, Street Fighter 2 has more iterations than any other game in the series. Yeah, even more than the Alpha series and its various Gold, Dash and Upper variations. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is generally considered to be the last of the big Street Fighter 2 releases. Coming out in early '94, it was the final game in the series before a true sequel in Street Fighter Alpha would arrive in '95. It's also most likely the last version you saw as an arcade machine. Capcom being Capcom hadn't finished milking the shit out of this game just yet though. After Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, there was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival for the Game Boy Advance, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix for both the 360 and PS3, Ultra Street Fighter 2 The Final Challenges for Nintendo Switch, which sounds pretty final, but who can be sure at this point, and last but obviously not least, Hyper Street Fighter 2, which came out in 2003 for both the arcade and PlayStation 2, and later on in 2004 for the original Xbox. So, it's understandable if you've never heard of this particular version, which is a shame because it's definitely one of the more interesting. Now, although it's not the last version of Street Fighter 2 to come out, it was the last to get an arcade release. I never personally saw this in the wild, but according to Wikipedia it happened, so it must be true. In Japan and PAL regions, the console versions were made available as a standalone, but in North America, it came bundled with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike in the Anniversary Collection. I was actually really bummed about this in 2003 because Third Strike was never made available on the PS2 and PAL regions. So what makes this version so special compared to all of the others? Well, just like Hyper Street Fighter Alpha, Hyper Street Fighter 2 provides the most comprehensive versus mode of all the Street Fighter 2 variants. It allows you to choose any character from the 5 arcade versions of the game. So, World Warrior, Champion Edition, Hyper Fighting, the New Challengers, and the Ultimate Championship. That's what Super Turbo is called for anyone who's struggling to keep up. Selecting a game doesn't just change the damage values and colours either, it presents the character exactly as they were from their respective game. This includes additional frames of animation, moves, and balance changes from that game, as well as the original portrait artwork. It's essentially a what-if decider that lets you find out how the characters from each game would fare against each other. So, for example, if you've ever wondered if the OG World Warrior Ryu could hold his own against the Super Turbo Ryu, this allows you to do that. By the way, he totally doesn't. Aside from the increased roster, the game is presented in much the same way as Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. It has the same endings in the arcade mode, the same character select screen, and the same music. You can, however, change the music to the older versions if you prefer. The new challenges from Super have even been retrofitted with CPS1 background tunes when you select that version of the music. This isn't really all that exciting, but it's interesting when you consider that someone would have had to go back and recreate these tunes in the old style. The stages are more or less the same as they were in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but they do include some elements from the earlier games, such as the breakable signs in Ryu's stage. These details are likely to go unnoticed by everyone but the dedicated enthusiasts, but it does seem to indicate that this wasn't just a simple cash grab.
Round 1, fight!
The gameplay is largely the same as the original arcade games with some very minor differences, like some characters being able to do reversal supers where they couldn't before. Like everything else though, unless you're extremely familiar with the original arcade cabinets, you probably won't notice any of these small changes. Like, there's a bug with the arcade version of Super Turbo where charge characters can't store their supers. This is now fixed, although by holding start you can revert it back to the vanilla arcade version. Thank goodness for that, I guess. As you'd expect from a Street Fighter 2 game, it's insanely hard. Even on the default setting, which is very easy, prepare to have your ass beaten like a rented mule. It is possible to make it easier, and you can also modify the turbo setting. So if Turbo 2 doesn't feel fast enough, it goes all the way up to 4. I'm not really sure who this is for, but setting it to the highest speed and difficulty is good for a laugh if nothing else.
You lose.
Unlike other Capcom collections, this one is pretty light on extra stuff. Outside of arcade mode, you've got verses and training. There's a gallery too, but there's no artwork or behind the scenes content. It does include the awesome anime film, which would have been really nice, except that it looks like it was compressed to run on a Nokia 6600. It's also heavily censored, so no cartoon boobies or swears for you. You can watch the original intros for all 5 games, which is kind of cool, but it looks like they've been pre-recorded rather than running in-game. As a result, they all look a little soft and low res. What would have been amazing is if you could customize the game to boot with the intro of your choice, but I think I know why this isn't possible. It probably has something to do with there not being any way to save. So for example, while you can change the music, it's only set for that session. When you turn the game off, it resets. This may not seem like that big of a deal, but this also extends to high scores and the button configurations. I could take or leave the high scores, but having to reassign your buttons every time you boot it up is pretty shit. This is easily the biggest issue I have with Hyper Street Fighter 2. Why the same level of care that's present elsewhere wasn't extended to something as simple as allowing you to save settings makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't ruin the experience, but it certainly adds an extra layer of hassle every time you want to play it. The other issue I have with it is there aren't many secrets. Capcom usually stuff their games full of things to unlock and hidden options, but not here. It has the ability to choose some original arcade variants of characters, and it has one hidden character. And while Akuma is cool, he's a pain to unlock. I don't really understand why either. He features prominently in the promotional material for both Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Hyper Street Fighter 2. Why it couldn't have just been as simple as pressing up like in X-Men vs Street Fighter to select him, I'm not sure. Again, it's not the end of the world considering how overpowered he is, but frustrating nonetheless. Hyper Street Fighter 2 is arguably the most complete and authentic home port of Street Fighter 2. Sure, the arcade mode is familiar, but the Versus offers something no other version of Street Fighter 2 can. It's also a pretty neat way to provide all 5 games in the one package. If you're not a hardcore enthusiast, you'd be hard-pressed to see all the small differences between each version of each character, but this clearly wasn't made for casual fans. This is the superfans version of the game, and for Street Fighter 2 fanatics and completionists, it's most definitely a must-own. But let me know what you think. What's your pick for the best version of Street Fighter 2? Drop me your thoughts below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, a like is always appreciated, and conversely, a dislike will let me know that I've done a shit job and need to do better. Subscribe to stay up to date when I drop a new video or post. You can hit that bell too if you like pressing buttons, but otherwise, thanks for your time.